about some style sheets. Yay! Me too. Okay. Who else thinks that CSS is hard? I do. Yes, me. Many times. Also, the internet. We agree with you. But there are a lot of reasons that CSS is difficult. There's no error reporting. Like all of the other languages that we tend to use, CSS doesn't have that by nature. So if you forget a curly brace or a semicolon, your page is still going to render, but you're not going to have the anticipated result that you were expecting. And then it's really hard to know exactly what broke. Then you have to kind of know what to look for, and there's not a sane way to really do that. It just kind of comes with practice. The other thing too is that, like Mira had just said, that weird browser compatibility thing of JavaScript rendering differently in different browsers, CSS does the exact same thing. So every browser is going to render CSS slightly different. Couple that with mobile devices, different operating systems, different versions of operating systems. It can be a nightmare. And then we also have specificity, which I feel like is one of those things that we kind of know that there's like a thing about specificity with CSS, but we don't really know why it's so complicated, and so we end up just having to deal with it, and it really can be difficult. So I am here to tell you that yes, CSS is kind of hard, but it doesn't have to be. I feel like what happens when we get into a situation where our CSS code base is not performing in the way that we're expecting it to, this simply happens because we're not respecting the rules of CSS, and we don't actually know what it's supposed to be doing. And we're not making CSS work for us, we're actually working against it, and in making our lives way harder. So the first thing that we need to understand when we're talking about CSS and how to kind of make it work for us, we need to understand about the cascade. And so CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, so it's in the name, it is a feature, not a bug. It is supposed to be there. And CSS is doing exactly what it's supposed to be. So instead of fighting the cascade, let's figure out some ways to actually make it work for us. And so what is this cascade? The cascade is really made up of three big concepts. First is source order, and then specificity, and then importance. And we're going to kind of go through these. Source order, pretty easy to understand. CSS is a top-down language. So things that are at the top, if you have something at the bottom of the file that overrides it, like here in our example, we have two paragraph classes, or two paragraph statements, one red, one blue. The blue one comes after, so the red is never going to get called. We're never going to see a red paragraph. The same kind of happens too when we have two different files. So if you have a file in your file system that is early, and then you override that same file later in the system, then you're going to have the same exact effect that we're seeing here. It also works across files. Next is specificity. And so this is really the concept that certain selectors override other selectors, which sounds counterintuitive, but it is doing exactly what it's meant to. The idea here is that IDs have the most specificity, classes are the next layer of specificity, and then elements are the least specific. So in this example here, we have, again, two paragraphs, but we have one that has a class of paragraph and then one that doesn't. So even though that P without the class is later in our style sheet, it's never going to get called because P with a class of paragraph is more specific. Next is importance. And this, of course, is bang important, which is the other two pieces of the cascade are interesting because they're kind of like they're ideas and they're concepts, whereas bang important is just a tiny little piece of syntax that then you can write and it blows everything up. It overrides all of our source order and all of our specificity. So what it's doing is it's actually throwing out our ability to write predictable and scalable CSS. Sure, it might make things work, but every time that you do it, you should also assume that you're making more work for yourself later, and that you're going to have to work around it again. It makes things super hard to change, and so this is why the concept of bang important should very, very rarely be used, even though I know, we all do it. So that's the cascade. And I really feel like bad CSS happens when we don't understand that, when we don't make our code use the cascade, and when we're trying to override the cascade. This makes our code extremely difficult to maintain. It costs more to update, both in time, money, and headaches. So what do? How can we save us from ourselves? Because I feel like that's the big piece. There are two big ways that I feel like have really changed the way that I think about CSS, and I will never write my CSS code bases in the ways that I was doing it 2 years ago because of these two concepts: organization and componentization. And first, we're going to talk about organization with ITCSS, and that is a term that was coined by Harry Roberts. He's CSS wizardry on the interwebs. And ITCSS stands for Inverted Triangle CSS. It is simply a way to organize your CSS code so that the cascade works for you. ITCSS is a methodology that can be used with CSS preprocessors or without, so it's really an easy-to-use tool that you can apply to every code base, regardless of whether you're using Sass or CSS or less. And then it's also compatible with other CSS methodologies like the BEM naming convention or SMACS or object-oriented CSS. The other thing I want to really stress about this is that it is a philosophy, not a framework. So this is not something that we're going to be downloading some code. It's not like Bootstrap. We're not going to download some code, put it into our application, and then suddenly we can add some classes and get really pretty buttons. That's not what this is. This is simply a way to think differently about how you organize your style sheets. So we start out with, we're going to organize our stuff in this inverted triangle way, and things at the top are going to have the farthest reach. They're also going to be the least specific. And then as we move down the triangle, we're going to increase specificity and increase explicitness and decrease the amount of reach. So what does this mean? We're actually going to break up that triangle into different sections, and we're going to talk about each one of these individually. First is variables. This is a section that is optional, so if you're writing just plain CSS, no Sass, no less, you obviously don't have any variables, and I feel very bad for you, but I write in everything using SCSS, so we always have a variables directory. This is going to be things like fonts, colors, measurements, breakpoints, all kinds of things that we're going to reuse all over our app. In the next layer down, we have tools. And this is everything that should be globally accessible. This is going to be like mixins, functions. Again, this is another section of the layers that is optional. So if you're not using preprocessors, you don't necessarily need to include this section. And in these first two layers, in the variables and the tools, we're actually not making any CSS that's going to have an effect on our page. So if you just include, the variables files and the tools files, and you have some HTML, your HTML should be unstyled. There should be no styles happening to it, and we're going to do all of that in the later sections. But first, we need to do that base reset thing. So again, toward to the browser compatibility idea, complication, issue, I don't know what you want to call it, situation. We have normalize and we have browser resets that is going to make it so that our CSS is going to render more predictably across browsers. And we kind of stick that in this general layer. And this is the first layer that is going to generate any actual CSS. But it's still going to be pretty unstyled. The normalize and base resets don't have any styling. They're just doing a little bit of tweaking to make all the browsers render raw HTML in a pretty consistent way. The next big one that we're going to do is the base elements. So this is where we're actually going to start styling are unique pieces of our application. So this is going to be H1s, paragraph tags, inputs, buttons, things like that. Next layer down is components, and this is everything that's actually unique and discrete to our app. So when we have a designer that's doing their design work and they hand off our mockups to us, we're going to then look at that page and think about what kind of components are on that page, and all of our styles for those are going to go in this file directory. And the next one down is utilities. This is a section that we tend to use for overrides. And this is the only place where bang important should ever be used, because sometimes you just kind of can't get around it, although you can, but sometimes we don't have time. You know, software, that's how that works. So what does this look like in like a real kind of app? So at TableXI, we have a starter assets repo that we include in all of our applications when we build up a new one. And so here you can actually see what our base file structure even looks like. And you can see that we actually don't have a general layer. We include our resets in the tools, and then we also added a layer for structure, because we felt like it was important to have a little bit of grid there, a little bit of layout, and some other structure pieces. I like to think that so IT CSS by nature says that you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do that, and you should follow the exact layers of the triangle that they say. I don't believe in dogma. I believe in doing what works for you and taking the unique constraints of your team and your situation into account, and then going from there. And so in this example, you can then see how we on the right side, we have the application.scss file. And so the order that we're including these is important as well. So we need to bring them into our application per the IT CSS rules based on reach going down to the specificity. So we have all of our variables at the top, then tools, then base, then structure, components, and utilities. So what does this buy us? Come on. Our code is going to be more reusable and more scalable. It's also going to reduce specificity, because we're not undoing styles that are earlier in the application. Less waste, smaller files, and you guessed it, more delightful. So now, after we kind of understand the basis of how we can organize our code to help us understand and build our system in a way that's going to be more maintainable and scalable, the next piece we need to talk about is componentization. And that's the idea that we're going to build discrete, self-contained, and reusable pieces of code. And this is going to go in our components directory. And then what we do is we actually build these as small as possible, and then we add them together to get the desired effect. And so I have a little example that we're going to work through. Let's say that our extremely talented, award-winning designer has handed us this, and we need to build it. And so it's really just kind of like a quick little blog roll. We have some entries. We have an article title. It has an image and some copy, and then a section header at the top. And the first one is, we're calling that the featured one. We're going to call it out, and it has a little bit of a different style. So what's the first step if we're handed a design and then we have to actually kind of start building this up? The first thing I do is set up the base styles first. So this is going to be things like our fonts, colors, sizing, and measurements. This is really looking at the design that we've been given, setting up our variables, setting up the foundation so that then we can start building up those styles and then getting the desired effect. So this is an example of our variables directory, and I've kind of split it out by the different files that would be happening. So we have a measurements file that has the site max width and some gutter values. We have a colors variable file with all of our color variables in there. Fonts with our font family, font sizes, font weights, and some breakpoints. This is by no means exhaustive. This is just for this example. And then in the base directory, we're going to actually start styling the base elements. So We have a little bit of like a shared styling for all of our H1 elements, or not H1, H1 through 6. And then more explicit styling for the H1, 2, and 4. And then we're going to do a little bit of setup in our structure too. For just having a container, it has a max width. We're going to center that content in the center. And so what happens, what's our page look like when we just add that? So right now, all I have is a container class at the top. No other class is happening. Everything else is raw HTML. And you can see that it's very unstyled. Looks pretty much like a base HTML document. So if we're actually going to start building up these other styles, the next piece is the components. And in our mockup, the way I like to think about this is we're going to have 2 sets of components. One is going to be text components, and then one is going to be the entry components. And so this is kind of that concept of building discrete reusable components that then add together to get the desired effect. So instead of, do you work? Oh, it's not going to work. So instead of having like the article title and the subtitle be styling components that are a part of that entry, we're actually going to build them as the text components, so then we can reuse them outside of the entry context. And just like our entry components, then we got to think about like what are the elements that are in there. We have the entry itself, we have an image, we have the content, and then we have the featured styling that gets applied to the top one. So what's this kind of look like? In our components directory, now we've created a file called text. And so this is an example of those text components. And you can see that like in my section header, it just has a little bit of it has the border on the bottom, and it has a font weight of bold. And then our titles, which are the purple and the blue ones, they're going to have the font family of sans serif, because that's the design that we want. And then our subtitle is going to be changing the color here. And then so in our markup, what we do is we actually chain these things together. So for our purple title, it's really H3, title, and then we have title dash dash purple, which changes it to purple. And then for our blue subtitles, the markup for that is title.subtitle. And so that's a good example of how we're creating 2 distinct things and then chaining them together to get the desired effect. And so now you can see that we have a little bit more of our styles happening, at least in our text components. We have our styled section header and our styled article titles. So next, we're going to work on the entry components. So if I go in and I start adding some classes to my markup, just to think about how I want to lay out my entry components, I'm going to start by adding some classes. So I just add entry at the top, and then we at TableXI use the BEM naming convention, so that's why you're seeing like entry __ image. That this philosophy is not dependent on BEM. It kind of works well with it, but you can use any naming convention that you'd like. Then we have entry content, entry body, and then I also added a class of entry image. And then we're going to write a little bit of code for our entry. For this, I'm actually using Flexbox to do the positioning. But even in this example, like for the entry, there are at least 3 different ways that you could position the image next to the content and then have it flow around it. I chose Flexbox. You could also use floats. You could use position at absolute, although I don't recommend it. Again, that's really just kind of driving home that there really is no one right way. Like, CSS is hard because it takes practice. You have to kind of spend enough time with it to know what situations are going to lend itself well to other things. So we add some styles for our entry. And what's our page look like once we've added that? So now we can see we have our floated content next to our images. We have a nice padding. We have some border, all of that good stuff. And so we're almost done. The next thing we need to do is do that featured entry styling and add a little bit of responsiveness. And so you can see here I've added some media queries to our entry and then also to our entry content. and also added an entry featured that's going to change the border and the background color. And so this is the final effect that we have, and you can see that it's fully responsive. And I actually did include a link to the CodePen example if you want to go poke around at it. All of this will be up on my GitHub. So now that we understand organization and componentization, and that was a very simple example, let's look at how powerful this can be. So here is a footer that I built at some point this year, and can anyone guess how many lines of footer-specific code there is to build this thing? Shout it out. 0? Oh man, I wish it was 0. It's 15, but you can see here that I'm really only styling footer and footer logo. So how in the world am I able to get all of this with only this code? And that's because, if you look at the HTML, all of the other styling is coming from other components. So things like inline list and link knockout gray, alt heading, link knockout. All of those are different styling that we're adding together to get this specific example. And so this is a really great scenario of how you can use reusable things, because what I really want is to not have to build it so that like that text uppercase styling on our footer links is only used in the footer. I want it to be able to be used in other parts of the application. So I have to build it that way, and I have to think about it that way. And so that's why, in this example, we really only have like 2 pieces of footer-specific code, and then everything else is able to be reused in other places in the application. This is how I feel every time now that I get to like write HTML and CSS, and I hope that at least one person got something out of this talk and will take this and make their CSS code bases a little more delightful. Thank you so much. I am What the Fluckey on the interwebs. Please come find me. I do work for TableXI as well. I know we've been, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of us around today. But we are hiring, and if you're interested, come talk to us. We'd love to chat for a little bit. Thank you.